This is Duke University.
Welcome everybody to Duke and to the joint degree program. We're thrilled that you're here. And this is a great setting. I love this room, first of all. It's just a nice kind of casual environment, and it's a good sized group to have an informal discussion about what is corporate sustainability, what are the issues that drive this agenda, why does this matter, what are the pathways that'll be open to you as you pursue careers in this area. Just by way of background, I've been at Duke for a couple of years, and as you can see, the world was actually a pretty different place here a couple of years ago, arriving to help start a focus on corporate sustainability. There was interest, but there wasn't a lot of organization of that interest. There weren't people who woke up and thought about these things every day. So we've been here for a couple of years. Katie came in a little over a year ago. And the number of students, the level of interest, the level of sophistication of those students, even in 2 years, we've seen real positive progress in that. So it's an exciting time that I think we're here at the beginning phases of something that I really think Duke's got a great opportunity to put itself on the map around, and for all of you to be part of helping to build that. So my own personal background before I came here, I have a sort of eclectic background. I started out originally as an anthropologist. I did field work in India and Nepal for several years, and spent most of my 20s sort of wandering back and forth to South Asia. And then went on, did a PhD in a field called Learning Sciences at Northwestern University, worked in Silicon Valley for a while. So I have a sort of a diverse background. In retrospect, I see this program and I really wish I had a chance to be in a program like this when I was going through school myself, but one, it wasn't available. I wasn't cued in on these issues in the same way that I am now. So next best thing to go through the program is to help all of you get a great experience by going through that program. So to some extent, we're living vicariously through your experience on this. By the same token, all of you, because you are here at the early phases, really have a chance to put your fingerprints and your ideas and your passion into this program and make it something that really has your own fingerprints be part of it as well. As I said, I came here about 2 years ago to help launch the Corporate Sustainability Initiative, which is a program that's ongoing, working with the Nicholas Institute and the Nicholas School around corporate sustainability programs, and we're still key partners in that effort. About 6 months ago, we saw the need and the opportunity to build something that was more focused in really driving a strategy around engagement with the energy sector. Depending on how you think of it, the energy sector is a pretty broad sort of crosscut. If you think from raw materials all through to end use of energy resources, it's an area that's of critical importance. It sits at the middle of our economy, something like 40% of the global economy. It also sits at the center of many of the sustainability issues, from climate change and water use and a lot of ecosystem services and a lot of the other issues that we care about. So I wanted to do a couple things in this talk. One is to give you sort of a 50,000 foot level view of corporate sustainability issues in motion, because I think this agenda is still developing and changing and moving in interesting and unpredictable ways. So I wanted to give sort of a sense of where I think the world is going around these issues. And then second, to really anchor it to what we are taking on with the launch of EDGE and our support to the dual degree program, where we think the opportunities and the issues that we really want to be focused on are. So to do that, I want to talk through, I called the talk After the Spill. We had to put a name on it back a couple months ago, and I said, I don't actually know what it's going to be like after the spill, but I know it's going to be important to be able to reflect a little bit on what's happened over the course of the summer with the oil spill, but not just that issue, the sort of broader range of issues that are currently confronting us economically, politically and as a society around these issues. Second, I wanted to talk about the notion of system transformation and what are those levers of transformation for the economy that I think all of us are interested in finding a way to move on and get momentum behind. There's a real mandate for change in the economy around this agenda, but it's not a simple task to figure out where are the levers to really move that in a profound, not incremental, but transformational way. I'll talk specifically about EDGE and what some of those levers are that we see on the horizon being interesting ones to track and ones where we want to really build capabilities, and then I'll conclude. So it's been a weird summer. Some of you may know Amory Levin's discussion of, it's not global warming, it's global weirding. It's been a weird summer in terms of the sort of broader impacts of what's happening in the environment. Now, I'm not here to tell you that these issues are directly derivative of climate change and take on the science of whether these are correlated, but no question we've had thousand-year events that seem to have clustered together in the last few months in a pretty powerful way, from the loss of ice in Greenland and the Pakistani floods and the wildfires in Russia. So a whole set of things that really are unprecedented in their scale and their severity, that are factors not just for the environment, but for society and for the economy at large. These issues are really beginning to make themselves felt not at the periphery, but really at the center of the kind of infrastructures and systems that we're embedded in. And we have a policy process that sort of is stalled, at least at the federal level in the US around climate policy. So where we thought we would be at this point a couple years ago and where we are is really different. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of angst and hand-wringing and finger-pointing, but there's a lot of uncertainty about where this agenda will go. On one hand, the sort of severity of events driving some really systemic kind of intervention on these issues, and yet a policy process that isn't quite clear how to orient ourselves and put a set of policies that will address these issues in a significant way. I think, one of the most interesting things over the summer, harrowing, really depressing at times, but really fascinating, is this image, which we all saw plenty of over the course of the summer, the spill cam. There are a lot of interesting things about this. One is that it's brought to you by BP. This is on their website. So just think about that. I think that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago to think that the biggest environmental disaster that the U.S. has faced would be brought to you by cameras, brought to you by the company itself, put on their website with 24-hour visibility. We live in a world where these things are not, and this wouldn't be easy to hide in any case, but the level of transparency that is built into the system. This isn't BP's great work that they were so transparent about this. It's actually sort of comes with the territory. This stuff is out front, and that they, you could look at any point to see this unfolding. How many of you think that the oil spill, either in the short term or the long term, will have a big impact in the way the company or the country addresses these sustainability issues? How many of you think that this has the potential to be a transformative event for the country around these issues? Yes? Most? Anyone know? I think what we know is that we don't know yet. As I've read this, if you look at sort of the history of these kinds of events and their long-term impact, it's not always evident within the first few months whether these things will have the traction to really drive systemic change. I think it's uncertain. There isn't the kind of movement, sort of coalition building that would, you might consider coming out of this, and yet I think there's a lot sort of underneath the surface that we're not quite sure where it's going to take us as a society. I think there are hints of some changes in the ways we think about these issues, though. This is the NPR's, website. You can actually see the number of gallons that were being, leaked at any given time. I think the immediate questions that came to people's mind are things like, okay, who's at fault here and who's going to pay? So issues of accountability were brought up in a really powerful way, and has really been at the second, really at the forefront of the discussion. Can it be fixed? I think we have such a sense of technology, utopianism in the U.S. that if there's a problem, we can have a technology that can fix that problem. And so an issue that we weren't even sure if this thing was fixable, if it actually could eventually be plugged, it's a question we really haven't asked ourselves before. How much oil? The level of discrepancies in the estimates of how much oil was actually released, even up to recently between the government's estimates and what the scientists are now saying, or the amount of oil that's still in the ocean, widely disparate sort of estimates of that. And what's the direct damage? Don't know. There's a set of longer term issues as well. What's the impact going to be on ecosystems and communities? Issues of corporations. Can corporations be trusted? And what should the government do to put a set of policies in place that can really drive these issues? We got focused on the oil spill over the summer, but I really loved, I don't know how many of you read The Onion, but I thought this was a pretty interesting sort of point of view. The environmental disaster isn't just what's happening in the Gulf. This is a tanker full of oil that safely went into port and then was delivered all across the country to be burned and released into the atmosphere. And this is happening every day. So I think while we sometimes get focused on the crises, the challenge of this is that there are systemic aspects of the way that our economy currently works and the way it's fueled that has longer term implications that sometimes we don't pay as much attention to. How do we get that level of attention to the everydayness of the environmental and social impacts of the economy, not just the disasters? So I think there's a set of transitions that are underway. As we speak, some of these at different levels of maturity. I think one is from cheap energy to extreme energy, that it's harder and harder to find the kind of resources that our economy has become dependent on. So the depth of the ocean that we need to go to drill, or the extent to which we need to go to countries that are unstable, or the techniques that are used to release the resources, whether it's from the tar sands or fracking of natural gas reserves, a kind of an increasing level of sophistication and of risk that comes with it. Second is that I think most companies have thought about risk management in terms of those things that are somewhat likely and could have somewhat big impacts. How do you manage those issues? That's been sort of the sweet spot for the way that companies have thought about risk management. But increasingly, the issues that we really have to be concerned about, and the spill, I think, is an interesting example of this. It's the not very likely, but if it happens, it's catastrophic. Is the kind of challenge that we really don't know how to manage, what you might call the long tails, those low probability but high impact kind of events. How do we even get our heads around how much to invest to avoid those things? Do we just pray that they don't happen under our watch? Or are there different kind of risk management regimes that can deal with those issues in a way that's different than that sort of sweet spot of medium impact, medium likelihood sorts of events? So risk management is changing. There's an increasing focus, and you even heard this in the oil spill, but it's happening in lots of places, a move from sort of thinking about the responsibility and the actions of the enterprise to the broader value chain. Even with the oil spill, BP has been sort of the focus of this, but they're pointing fingers. Well, what about Transocean? What about, Bechtel? What about the other companies that did other pieces of this project? What accountability did they have? How are they knit together into the fabric of these global value chains? And I think that's a pervasive thing that's happening. It's sort of diffusing from the enterprise level to the value chain level. Move, I think, from a framing on these issues from morality or corporate responsibility to these really being material risk issues. So I think the nature of the issue is changing, and the way that people talk about it is changing, from people in companies being buffers for the company. We're the Environment, Health, and Safety Department, and we manage these issues on behalf of the company so the rest of the people can make money. A move to really seeing these issues at the board level as being strategic issues. Will we have the resources to be able to continue to grow our business? Will we have the social and legal license to operate? What will be the costs of increasing scarcity and challenge around securing energy resources. These kind of issues are strategic board issues, not just sort of sideline buffer issues that they have been in the past. And then finally, I think, clearly the trust in BP has gone, through the floor. But I think for companies in general, if there is any trust, it's trust but verify. So that trust has really been disrupted, and I think companies increasingly have the requirement to verify and show and demonstrate and measure their impacts on environmental and social factors and make that available to the public. So the bigger challenge with all these things, the driver, is that the world's an increasingly crowded place. Population has gone up dramatically. We have a whole set of institutions and processes that are a few people living in a world with surplus resources where that equation is really being flipped. We have the challenge that there's the mass migration of people into urban areas around the world. It's incredible the speed of transformation that's happening in the world as people move from rural areas into the cities. Now, from a sustainability perspective, this has sort of a mixed impact. On one hand, cities typically are places where people consume energy, they want transport, they want electricity, they want access to communications and a whole set of sort of energy-intensive needs and wants that come with the transition to urbanization. By the same token, there's efficiencies of scale in urban areas that are quite positive. So how that's going to net out with people moving into the cities in terms of our ability to live within the limits of the biosphere, I think it's quite uncertain, but it's an interesting challenge, and how to build the right set of institutions and practices and technologies for an urban world, I think, is a huge challenge over the course of your working careers. Vehicle ownership projections to 2050 just through the roof. I was in India over Christmas time, and in the capital city there, they're giving 10,000 permits per month in a place where there hasn't been a new road built in 20 years. So incredible impacts on this kind of incremental, adding more and more vehicles to the existing infrastructure, really overwhelming the system in many cases. And what this rolls up to is increasing demand for energy on several fronts from all the sources we can. You look at India and China and the just incredible hunger for energy resources and what's that's driven in terms of their going and creating, partnerships around the world wherever they can get access to those resources. Now, it's not an India and China problem. That's the way that the developed countries have operated through, the last several decades. But that, search for, available, affordable energy resources is going to dominate. And I think what you see is, like I said, with people moving into the cities, they want the 3 C's. They want the car, the condo, and the cell phone. And the energy demand that's implied by those 3 factors is almost overwhelming when you really begin to add up the numbers of people and the energy demand that comes with it. How will we meet that demand in a sustainable way? It means that a lot of resources are going to be put under stress, from food resources. Again, just a little experience from India. We were in India 13 years ago with my family. At the time, we had a big feast, and my wife's family's from India, and they put the food out on the table, and we had 5 or 6 different vegetarian dishes and a meat dish. We were there again this last Christmas, and we had a similar kind of gathering with family members coming in. And they put the food out on the table, and it was 5 or 6 meat dishes and a vegetable. And so this kind of change that's going on in terms of people climbing the protein ladder with their diets, the impacts that has in terms of resource use, the water intensity, the energy intensity of natural resources associated with richer diets. So can we rise to this challenge? This is an interesting study done by McKinsey. If you look at the history of industrialization, one of the primary factors that drove wealth creation in industrialization is that labor productivity went up dramatically through the use of technology. And that happened over a period of about 130 years, a dramatic increase in the level of labor productivity. Now, if you applied a similar metric, but to carbon instead of to labor, which is how much economic value do you get per unit of carbon emitted, we need to have an industrial revolution scale of change. And we need to do it, according to the scientists, in about a third of the time is what it took to make the transition to a fully industrial economy, at least in the countries that happened. So scale is similar to the industrial revolution and on 3 times the pace. So that's the challenge. And can we do it within the limits of the biosphere? This is a nature study that was a pretty interesting sort of take on the different dimensions of what living within the limits of the biosphere really amounted to, from climate change and ocean acidification and biodiversity loss, and where we're at on those metrics, sort of exceeding the limits of what the natural environment can sustain. And you can see there's a lot of work to be done. It's not the same across all these dimensions, but a real reordering of the way the economy works in order to achieve a different kind of outcome on this front. So, you know, where are we now? It's a big challenge, right? We're sort of between a rock and a hard place. I love this picture. Because the demands are growing and the resources are under great stress. So these are the grounds for transformation. And I actually think this is a great challenge for those of you who are pursuing this, who can see in that bifocal way, really understanding that the challenge on the sustainability front, but the role that business can play in really driving to a different set of outcomes than the ones we've achieved so far. So where does EDGE fit in? EDGE's vision is that we play a central role in accelerating the global transformation toward a prosperous and sustainable energy system, economy, and society. So what we really want to focus on is this is a global program. It's not enough to think about this in narrow parochial terms. It's got to be a global solution to these issues, since our economy is fundamentally interlinked, from the resources that we use to where these products are consumed. We live in a global system. Transformation, not just transition, not just incremental, but really transformative change in the way that the economy works, and that the energy system's at the center of that, but it's not only about the energy system. That is as a foundation for the way that the broader economy and society works. So this is EDGE's role in the mix. And as I talk through each of those are sort of the key terms that I think we want to focus on: global, system, and transformation. EDGE's 2 lenses in terms of thinking through these issues. Both Katie and I come out of a kind of a corporate sustainability background. Before I came to Duke, I was at CocaCola for most of a decade. And I led the work on water sustainability there. So my sort of forte in this space was working to really make the case for a company like CocaCola to think differently and behave differently about its primary resource, which is water. Water is fundamental. It's so 90% or more in every single thing that CocaCola makes. And under increasing stress in many places in the world, how does a company that really has a strategic interest in the preservation of this resource interact with that resource and with other stakeholders around that issue in fundamentally different ways? I'm not going to talk a lot about the Coca-Cola experience, but I think that grounding of really seeing the strategic importance of these issues to the success, long-term success of the business is critical to what we're up to here. By the same token, we see the need to really drive an approach on the energy sector, creating a much closer connectivity for all of you to those players that are driving the sort of ongoing evolution of the energy system. And then from that, making a connection to the market and working back and saying, well, what are the kinds of experiences and classes and extracurricular experiences that all of you should have to be able to successfully be leaders in that industry. And then on that basis, what are the kind of courses that you should have? And who should we have here teaching if we're going to actually be able to deliver that kind of content? So we sort of think of our sweet spot being both in the corporate sustainability area and in the focus on the global energy sector and in their intersection. So sustainability issues, in the energy sector are really where we're I think have a unique opportunity. If you look across schools, there's not many schools, I think, that have the unique kind of interdisciplinary set of assets and resources that Duke has on this. So while you're here, you're going to be in Nikola School and Fuqua, but you should recognize that this is actually something that the broader campus, from the School of Public Policy to the engineering school to the law school, has all seen as a really strategic priority for the school. So, you know, I think you've come at a really interesting time that the school is putting this at a level where we see this as a cross-Duke opportunity. Not any one school can do it alone, but together we can do something that I think very few other schools can deliver on. As I said, we're focused on both the energy system and the energy sector. How many of you have seen this map before? Few of you have seen this. I think this is a really provocative map. It's a map, and it's a little bit dated. I have a more recent one, but you can't see the graphic as well. So the same point holds. Essentially, it says, here are the inputs to the energy system on the left, from nuclear and hydro and biomass, natural gas, coal, and petroleum. Where does that actually go in terms of electrical power, and then into the transport system? How much of that is used in the energy system, and how much of that is actually lost over the period from when it's derived from the source and then actually transported to where it's used. So a few things that are interesting about this. One is it's an incredibly complicated system. Some people call the system that delivers this the world's most complex machine. If you think about it, that's really what it is. It's at least in the US, this is a machine that spans the entire country and needs to be connected in a way that any machine that actually is going to function needs to be connected. If you think about this too, there's multiple industries that are embedded in this system, from the raw materials suppliers to the utilities to the automotive industry to all the enablers to this, from finance to consulting to the full range of kind of enabling industries that support this. And then I think finally this interesting finding that about 59% of the energy that's sourced is actually lost in the process of taking it and transmitting it to where it's needed. So enormous amount of waste in the system. Some of this comes just from the fact of the second law of thermodynamics. You're going to have some losses in these systems. So 100% is not a realistic goal. But the amount of waste that our current energy system has across each step of the way is extraordinary. And I think that's really interesting for students like you who are thinking about where will the career opportunities be? Where will the entrepreneurial opportunities be? And I think if I were in your shoes, I would be thinking, almost 60% of the energy that is harvested gets lost. It never gets put to use. In other words, there's no economic value that's really derived from that lost energy either. So I think the entrepreneurial opportunities of the future will be when you can unwind these sort of strands that go into the waste category and find a way to weave them back into the economy. Every time you can take those strands and weave them back into the economy in a productive way, that's an economic opportunity. So I think the broader sort of need is people who get really laser focused on thinking about where is there waste in this system and how do we transform that waste into productive use in the economy through efficiency, through new technology, through new business models. So I think there's a lot here that can inform where the future's headed. Around corporate sustainability, I think we've seen an evolution over the last number of decades. If you think about where companies started on these issues, formation of the EPA, essentially it was around, compliance with regulations. So companies created environment, health, and safety departments in order to manage the risks associated with new requirements of the government. So it was all about keeping the risk at bay, not paying the fines, keeping the CEO out of jail. But it wasn't a real strategic function. This is something that the company needed to have in place to keep themselves out of trouble, but it wasn't central to the company. I think the second wave of corporate sustainability was around this triple bottom line notion, and especially the opportunity for efficiency savings, cost savings in the system. The recognition that a lot of this work wasn't costing the company. It actually potentially could save them by using resources more efficiently than they had before. But I think what we're seeing, and this is continuing to evolve, is a third wave. And as I've mentioned before, I think there's several sort of features of that third wave. It's around creating value. It's about being proactive and innovative in the ways that you engage around these issues. It's an orientation to the broader business system that you're involved in, not just the enterprise, and that this is really a basis that you can differentiate yourself in the marketplace if you play your cards right. So I think this evolution continues to play out, and I think it's an exciting field to be in because it's different now than it was 2 years when we got here, even if you begin to pick up on what people are saying. What does Duke and Fuqua in particular, in this case, have to offer to this? There's several strengths of the business school here that I wanted to highlight. There's a group of psychologists that really are driving state-of-the-art in understanding how people think about things like efficiency. Some of you might know about the Rick Larrick and Jack Soll's work around the MPG illusion, that when people estimate sort of the efficiency of cars, imagine they have a car that makes 10 miles a gallon and they want to upgrade either that car or a car that gets 30 miles a gallon. And they want to take the 10 to one that gets 15, or should they take their 30 mile a gallon and upgrade it to one that gets 50 miles a gallon? Systematically, if you ask people this, they say, oh, well, look, you know, from 30 to 50, that's a bigger jump. So I get more efficiency bang for buck if I upgraded from the 30 mile a gallon to the 50 mile a gallon. In fact, there's more gallons saved if you move from 10 miles a gallon to 15 miles a gallon. So people systematically don't know how to process these sort of efficiency decisions. There was a study that came out just in the last couple of weeks, people trying to figure out the trade-offs between should they insulate their house or should they, you know, not go on one cross-country trip, which would be better from a, you know, carbon savings perspective. People have no idea how to make these trade-offs. So how people think about these issues is really critical to finding ways to change those behaviors. Second, there's a big focus on entrepreneurship and innovation, and this is pervasive across the school. You'll see this in Nikola's school as well as in the engineering school, an interest in how do you support new entrepreneurial innovations in the marketplace? Where do those ideas come from and how to grow them? Third, there's work around disclosure. One of the interesting things that's happening is increasingly companies are expected to disclose their performance around environmental and social performance. Most of you probably know about Carbon Disclosure Project. And it's becoming essentially a requirement that companies submit their carbon emissions to the Carbon Disclosure Project. And now Carbon Disclosure Project data is being picked up by Reuters and Bloomberg and the investor sites because investors increasingly want to know this kind of information. So what impact does that disclosure have on the way that investors value companies? So this is a third area of interest we have here. And then finally, navigate. Companies are embedded in these global value chains. When we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in a moment. But how do you move not just a single company, but the entire value chain to do something different than what it's done historically? One of the things we've done over the summer is begun to build a board for EDGE. I wanted to give you some sense of the kind of companies that we're engaged in, from GE and Walmart to Rio Tinto, ABB. The point of the slide is that we've gone to these board members and begun to engage them in terms of what are the issues that are high priorities for them. I wanted to give you some hint of where they see the big challenges and priorities for their industry. Where are those levers of transformation that can really move these issues in non-incremental ways? We see 4 areas that are of interest to us where we're looking to find partners, build research opportunities, and find students to work with us around these areas. This is not a fixed set. This will evolve over the course of the year, but it's the beginnings of where the priorities for our work will come from based on the input from our board. Energy efficiency is something that is not new. It's been out there for the last 30 years, and yet there's a systematic gap between what theoretically the opportunity around efficiency is and what any particular company is actually capturing. So why is that? What can we do about that? I'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of these. Second is, right now, about 1 in 4 people in the world have never touched an on switch. So there is still enormous unmet demand for energy globally. And how those people come onto the energy system, whether it's fossil fuel based or renewable based, whether it's centralized or decentralized, will have critical implications for the nature of the future energy system that we live in. Third, we've talked about disclosure and transparency and around value chain thinking. Let me go a little bit into detail. Some of you may have seen this. This is the abatement curve that McKinsey did a few years back, saying, you know, what's essentially the cost associated with taking on things that would reduce the carbon impact of the economy. And those things range in terms of their return on investment. How many things actually could you do, even in the absence of a price on carbon, that just would pay for themselves because they'd reduce your energy costs or your water costs. And they've so laid them out here from, you know, the ones that pay back the quickest to the ones that actually would take much longer, if ever, to get a payback. And if you see down on this end, which are the things that you don't even really need a cost on carbon to be able to pursue, because you can make the economic case. Things like building insulation, fuel efficiency in commercial vehicles, lighting systems, air conditioning, water heating. These are the bread and butter issues, and yet companies still are not doing many of these things to the scale that they might, even though they pay for themselves. Why is that? Let me talk a little bit about something we're doing this fall. Jen and a number of other Duke students have been part of the Climate Corps program. And you also worked with the Climate Corps program this summer, so know it intimately. How many of you know about Climate Corps? So the couple that are involved. Environmental Defense Fund has had a program over the last 3 years where they have placed MBA students in summer internships to do work on energy efficiency and carbon savings opportunities with several leading companies. I think they had 8 graduates the first year, which was 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, 25 graduates last year, and 51 this last summer. That went and spent 3 months working on these issues in really leading firms, from Cisco to AT&T to Xerox. And you know, I was interested in these students that are smart, well-trained, going for whole summer internships focused on these issues, what they learned from that experience. So I called the EDF and I said, what do you do at the end of the summer to bring these people together? They say, well, currently we don't bring them together. You know, they write reports and we have ongoing interaction with them. So we said, well, what if we hosted an event here at Duke that brought together the last 3 years of Climate Corps graduates that had spent those summer internships and do a day-long facilitated workshop to try to glean the learnings about what are the barriers that companies face when they try to capture these energy efficiency opportunities, and how do they overcome those barriers in order to sort of take advantage of the collective intelligence of this, you know, growing group of graduates of the program. So on September 17, we have an event here where we're bringing that group together. We've had great reception from the students and from the participating companies to begin to sort of identify what are those kind of keys to success that'll unlock those savings opportunities for companies. So these are the kinds of events that we're pursuing. Around prosperity pathways, you know, as I said, the way that the rest of the world comes onto the energy system will say a lot about the carbon intensity and the ultimate long-term, you know, environmental impact of the energy system. So what are those pathways? This is a pretty profound picture. These are guys, I think this is in Cameroon, in a place where the only lighting that's available at night is the street lights. And so at night, in order to study, the guys come out and sit on the road because it's the only place where there's enough light for them to actually complete their studies. So the challenge of overcoming energy poverty is profound. And there's some really interesting sort of new models emerging about how to meet that demand. And some of those solutions, they're not going to be just retrofit sort of solutions that have been developed in the West, brought to the developing world. They'll be organic solutions that work in the communities that might have very different kind of models that might solve these kind of problems in a more adequate way. When I lived in Nepal, I was in a village where one of my friends, about 6 months before I got there, had found out about a USAID program to provide energy by installing a micro hydro turbine in the creek that ran by the village. And he didn't speak English or write English, but he found somebody who did, and they submitted a proposal and they got it accepted. So USAID's funding allowed them to buy this micro hydro turbine and come in and by helicopter and drop it down in the village. And then a team of engineers came and built the platform for this and installed it, and it produced enough electricity to run a wire through 800 houses in that village for one light bulb per house. And that had happened about 6 months before I got there. And it was transformative in terms of what it meant. So finding, I'm not suggesting that's a real breakthrough in terms of how to provide energy, but I am suggesting that that's a huge issue that I think there's going to be increasing business opportunity around, and how we do it has real implications. We talked a little bit about disclosure and transparency. We're going to be launching this fall a project of research with several faculty across the university looking at disclosure behavior and its implications for investors, for employees, and for consumers. Do people care about companies' carbon emissions? And if so, do they value it, or do they punish companies because of their carbon emissions? What's the dynamic between disclosure behavior and the ways that these various constituencies think about companies? So again, an area that I think is increasingly important. I also included with that, some of you may know about the Footprint Chronicles. This is an effort that Patagonia's launched over the last couple of years. You can go onto Patagonia's website and click on the jacket you just bought, in this case a Talus jacket. And what pops up on the screen is the entire value chain that produced that jacket, from where the thread came from to the fabric, to the zipper, all the materials it took to produce that jacket pop up on this screen. And then each of these dots has videos that can actually show you the condition in the factories or the field maybe where the cotton came from. It has a set of metrics associated with carbon emissions and water use and toxics and social conditions in those places. And increasingly, I think companies like Patagonia are developing models to make ever more sort of their business transparent to the public. Now, that's a bit of an area of liability. Why would they do that? One of the reasons is because they're essentially crowdsourcing innovation. Along the bottom, you can't see this very well, but they have the good, the bad, and what we think. They tell you what they're doing in the positive sense, but they also tell you what are the problems that we're trying to solve that we don't know the answers to. They're using a toxic material, I think, for water resistance on their jackets that they know is bad, and they'd love to find a substitute, but they don't know what that substitute can be. And so by making this transparent, they're actually asking, scientists and other experts around the world to work with them to help solve these problems that they can't figure out how to do on their own. So I think this is an interesting sort of step for companies to open up, be transparent about where they have these challenges, and then really source where are the best solutions out there that can help to address that. This is the project I mentioned in terms of the disclosure in this piece of work around voluntary environmental disclosure, project called the Carbon Challenge, which is being supported by Deloitte. And the last area where I mentioned to you, I just wanted to go a bit in depth. I think there's a trend emerging in industry around value chain approach to sustainability issues. What do I mean by that? Most companies think narrowly about, if they're a manufacturing company, they think about what's the footprint of manufacturing, but they don't think about end consumer use, and they don't think much about the suppliers that input to the business. But depending on the nature of the business, for example, Walmart recognized that only 8% of their total environmental footprint was from their stores. 92% of their collective footprint was based on the suppliers that sold into Walmart. So if they're actually going to have real impact on these issues, they can't be doing it inside their own four walls. They have to engage their suppliers in new ways. I think this idea has begun to set in some interesting ways. So one of the reasons for that is increasingly the supply chain is where a lot of the value creation is coming from. in companies. So this is not only about the environmental performance, but the risks associated with an increasing part of the value proposition of businesses. Let me just walk through a few examples. We talked about Walmart. Walmart's evolution over the last several years is really interesting. I'm not putting them up as a champion by any means, but one of the things they've really driven is a set of ambitious goals around what they expect from their supply chain and the systems that will support them making that progress. They launched a sustainability index about a year and a half ago, which is a new set of metrics that they're evaluating all of their suppliers by, and increasingly driving their commercial decisions on the basis of those considerations around environmental impact as well. Just in the last few months, they've made a commitment to reduce 20 million tons of carbon emissions out of their supply chain. And so very concrete targets that they're driving in terms of their broader supply chain performance. So this, I think, was kind of the opening shot in this. But if just over the last few months, there has been kind of a whole set of lead firms that have significant supply chains that have begun to think, how do we actually drive change across that broader set of players that supply our business? One of them is P&G. And what they did is rolled out to 400 of their key suppliers a new sustainability supplier scorecard. They did this in an open source way. Essentially what they said is, we're going to make our 400 suppliers report on a set of environmental metrics, but we're going to do this in a platform that allows them to go to their suppliers and they go to their suppliers. So it begins to cascade through the entire value chain down to third, fourth level where maybe P&G doesn't know directly, but there's a kind of chain of accountability that sets up and cascades down through the value chain, establishing new expectations and new measures for sustainability performance. So that's one variant of what's happening, I think, inspired by Walmart, but really taking their own flavor. IBM has done something pretty interesting. They have not established any specific sustainability metric requirements, but they did require their key suppliers to upgrade their environmental management systems. So they have a process requirement. You have to start managing these systems, and you have to have a system in place to be able to establish a baseline and a process of continuous improvement in your operations. We don't know what your goals should be, but you have to have that process in place to meet our expectations. So a different approach, but trying to achieve a similar set of objectives. And then the one I was most closely associated with when I was at CocaCola, Coca-Cola's operations, we did work to measure our water use. And the way that Coke measures its water use is in terms of the amount of water that comes into a bottling plant versus the amount of product that comes out. And over the last number of years, that's gone from about 3 liters of water per liter of product. Now it's down to about 2. So we were measuring what happened inside the plant. I had sort of a eureka moment, though, when I realized that, if you looked at the amount of water it took to grow the sugar cane that goes into a liter of Coca-Cola, it's not 2 or 3, it's more like 200 liters of water that's embedded in that one ingredient. And it's not the only ingredient. And it doesn't include the package. Now, it's a complicated sort of metric to actually figure out how much of that water is consumed versus how much is evapotranspired through the plant. So I'm not suggesting that you should go out and say Coke uses 200 liters of water per liter of product for sugar cane, but it's orders of magnitude more impact on water resources from ingredients in the product than what happens in its manufacturing. So Coke buys about 4% of the world's sugar, which is a whole lot of sugar, but it's only 4%. If you really want to achieve change in the way that sugarcane is grown, you're not going to do it on the basis of using 4% of your market power to drive systemic change. So Coke worked with WWF to form something called the Better Sugarcane Initiative. And the goal of the Better Sugarcane Initiative was to bring together the whole value chain from the sugarcane growers all the way through to the end users to establish a new set of measures that could be used for environmental and social performance. And over a period of years, they were able to recruit Unica, which was the biggest Brazilian sugarcane grower association. 25 or 30% of all global sugar was under the Unica umbrella. So it got the growers at the table, along with the traders, along with the manufacturers that used it, along with the retailers, and said, okay, what are a set of standards that we can agree on that won't put the sugarcane grower out of business, but which will achieve a really different level of performance against these factors. And so over the last 3 or 4 years, the Better Sugarcane Initiative has just recently launched this new standard that establishes a different performance standard for sugarcane production. So a little bit different. It's around a commodity rather than around the whole value chain, but gives that sense of thinking systemically across the sort of organizations that have to be involved in any of these changes. And like I said, I think there's different levels of ambition for different companies, from Kaiser and P&G that really are just collecting data and maybe beginning to rate performance, to IBM that's now setting new standards, to CocaCola that's driving improvements, not across its whole supply chain, but in the sugarcane area, and Walmart that I think is doing a little bit of each of these. So I think there's kind of a maturity curve of how companies are engaging with their suppliers. But this is an area where I think there's going to be increasing work, increasing focus, increasing opportunity for professionals that can really understand the relationship of these broader system impacts and how that should be incorporated into the strategy of any particular company. I wanted to end with a graphic I found recently. You may know the name Tesla. Nikola Tesla was one of the great pioneers in terms of energy innovation back 100 years. Now the Tesla company that does the electric vehicles is named after him. But he actually was a really interesting guy, kind of a quirky guy. And he had a vision for what he called an electric city. He had a vision where he could imagine society to be remade around dense urban villages that were built around, in this case, Niagara Falls. He said Niagara Falls is this incredible source of potential energy that if we learn how to capture it, we could power an entire city on that basis. So he had a vision where a city would be basically placed over Niagara Falls with an ability through turbines to capture the energy from Niagara Falls that would power the entire city that lived upon it. One of the interesting things about that, he also proposed that the floor that separated the city from the falls should be transparent. Partly that was aesthetic to see the falls, but partly was his vision of how this would be a different kind of society, because one of the things he thought is people who keep the infrastructure of cities shouldn't be invisible. People who actually are managing the infrastructure and the systems that underlie society should be visible. We should know them. We should know what they do. We should know, what their contribution to society is. So somebody who is a real innovator in terms of energy and sustainability also had a really different vision of society. I guess the point I'd like to leave you with is I think the opportunity here is to think broadly and aspirationally, not just about how different technologies might meet our needs in different ways, or even just what the business models are that could drive successful entrepreneurial ventures around this, but be creative about the way that you think about what this means for society. If we're going to change, it's not going to be just changing our technology or our energy system or the way that our companies work. It's going to be a systemic change. That means that our society and our culture changes with it. So, Jared Diamond in his book Collapse talks about how, the choice is really in our hands. There's some societies that faced these kind of challenges and failed. They collapsed. But there are other societies that faced these challenges and succeeded. And it's only when they really thought profoundly about how to change the whole society, not just at the margins, but really thought differently about how the society worked, that they were able to navigate through these challenges and create a different and better and more resilient society. So I think, you have the chance, the need is going to be there, the mandate's going to be there to think profoundly about these issues. There's not going to be many people who have the skill sets and the knowledge base that you're going to have after 3 years in this program. And we're going to need leaders like all of you to sort of take this forward and animate people's imaginations about a different way for us to run our society. So welcome to the game, welcome to Duke, and I'm glad to see you all here and to have a chance to meet with you. Thanks. I can take any questions or comments.
How do we get involved with some of the projects in Edge?
Yeah, so between Katie and I, these projects are just beginning to get up and running, and there are student opportunities with these and others that we haven't mentioned. With each of the companies that we're working on, they all have interests in terms of projects to proceed. So my suggestion is, connect with Katie. Let us get a good model of kind of what your strengths are and what your interests are, and then as these opportunities begin to unfold, we'll circulate those opportunities for you to sign up and reach out to you if we know that it's a good fit. We have a fellows program which you'll learn about as well. Jen is one of our fellows. We work closely with our fellows on some of these projects, and we give them sort of first right of refusal on the project. So longer term, in the spring, you might think about becoming an EDGE fellow or a corporate sustainability fellow as this unfolds, so that you get exposure to these projects and can find the right fit with it. So get to know us, figure out where the fits are between what your interests are in these projects, and then we'll see what we can do. So it's a kind of an opportunistic process. There's not an easy way to sort of plug people in, because each of these projects needs to be managed as well. So it's whether the faculty is willing to oversee some of the projects or whether we do it. So we have to kind of work through some of those details, but essentially that's the route. Yeah?
The 4 segments that you kind of laid
Yeah.
out, efficiency and pathway.
Yeah.
Those 4, how did those come about? How did you guys come up with those 4 segments?
Well, those are sort of tentative priorities based on what we've heard from our board members. So I've spent a lot of time on the phone over the summer talking to each of the board members about, the energy and environment space is enormous, and where might we actually sort of create a community of interest and pursue research and create opportunities. What will our priorities be? And these are some of the themes that emerged in those discussions. So it'll be a work in progress. Over the course of the year, you'll hear about how these have evolved. You'll hear others that are on the table that weren't before, and some that may fall off because we don't get a kind of coalition built around them. But I did want to give you some flavor of where we think there are promising opportunities based on what we've heard from our board members. Anything else? Yeah.
The board that you guys currently have constructed,
Yeah.
what is their involvement roughly? I mean, how do they get involved with what we're trying to do?
So the core requirement is 2 on-site meetings a year in the fall and in the spring. That they come for 1 day. In the fall, they're going to be here for 2 days actually. November 4, we have an event on the future of energy with several high-level panelists. You'll hear more about that when the time comes. And then we have the board meeting on the 5th of November. So they'll be here that day, and we usually have found ways to get students engaged either in the board meeting or for opportunities around the board meeting. If we can get them to come in early. Usually when we have speakers or panelists, we'll also try to create kind of fireside chats where students have the opportunity to meet with some of these folks for an hour or hour and a half to discuss issues that are of interest to you. So whenever we bring people to campus, we try to maximize the exposure of them to the students and create the right venues for doing that. And we work with all the clubs. We oversee and work with 6 clubs on campus right now. So there's a lot of sort of overlap and different interest groups. But yeah, there's also a growing set of opportunities to be involved with those things. That's the board. We also have a seminar series that we're launching this year. There'll be 5 or 6 seminars over the course of the year, sort of 3-hour working sessions around energy efficiency and entrepreneurship and smart grid and energy prosperity. There's a lot of the same themes here where we're bringing in experts from the outside, and students can sign up to hear a keynote speaker from a real expert in the field, and then have an interactive session sort of working through some of the material, doing analyses related to those topics. We're doing one in in early October on energy efficiency, where the head of the Alliance to Save Energy is going to be the keynote speaker. And then for the working session, we've invited Ingersoll Rand, which sells energy efficient equipment, and one of their customers to come in to demonstrate the sales call for a company that needs to make the case to their customers for energy efficiency, since that's what they sell. And then have students be involved in terms of maybe doing some analyses that could support making the case to that customer. So kind of demonstrating what the interaction with a customer is around energy efficiency. So that's kind of the flavor of these. So those should be good opportunities to connect with companies and get exposed to this stuff. That's not classes and not just ad hoc talks, but sort of 3-hour working sessions that we'll do over the course of the year. So Katie will talk some more, I think, about some of these opportunities along the way. But we have a larger number of those kind of contact points than we did last year, and hopefully, increased number of opportunities for an increased number of students who want those opportunities. So, okay, all right. Well, good to meet you all. Yeah, thanks.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.